A Social History of Anthropology in the United States by Thomas C. Patterson. Chapter 3. Anthropology in the Search for Social Order, 1929 to 1945. The Depression and then the Second World War dominated everyday life during the 1930s and the 1940s. In the 4 years following the crash of the stock market in 1929, nearly 1 million farmers went bankrupt. 17 million workers, nearly a third of the total workforce, were fully unemployed, and 1 in 3 of those jobs work reduced hours. Industrial output declined by 50%, and the volume of foreign trade fell by 70%. The international position of the United States was weakened, and its capitalists struggled with their British counterparts for markets and investment opportunities in Latin America and Canada. In 1933, newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Congress controlled by the Democrats launched a series of programs called the New Deal that attempted to resolve the crisis. The federal government expanded its role as a consumer of goods and services, created relief programs for its workers, and reorganized business and labor relations in ways that would promote industrial growth and favorable investment opportunities at home and abroad. It also established public corporations, most notably the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built a network of dams and canals to protect the area from floods and a series of hydroelectric projects in the western states. In the process, the federal government became a major producer in the hydroelectric power and employer of large numbers of specialists and technicians. Big business and the investment banks sought and received the government's support for every phase of their internationalization and overseas expansion into new markets, especially in Latin America and the Pacific. The regulatory policies initiated by the federal government during the 1930s promoted continuous economic growth after the Second World War broke out. However, after 1940, the government intervened in the economy in unprecedented ways. For the Selective Service Act in 1940 underwrote the conscription of 10 million men for the military service during the war. The War Powers Acts of 1941 and 1942 permitted the president to resign personnel to negotiate cost-plus, no-bid contracts with private suppliers of war-related products, to use the Treasury as a printing press to finance deficits, and to censor communications between the United States and foreign countries. The Office of Price Administration, established in 1941, fixed rents and prices and used indirect sanctions to enforce its regulations. The Labor Disputes Act of 1944 permitted the federal government to seize production facilities and to intrude in labor markets. These and other policies provided the foundations for the military-industrial complex that emerged during the Second World War and that still continues to dominate everyday life in the United States. In the process, Congress surrendered constitutional powers to the executive branch of government. Civil rights were trampled as the Supreme Court upheld the incarceration of 110,000 Japanese Americans in concentration camps in the West. Companies that supplied products for the government, especially large ones such as General Electric, made enormous profits, billions of dollars, from the war. Anthropology on the eve of the Depression. 3 initiatives shaped the direction of the anthropological research in the United States after the First World War. Their importance derived from the research funds and the resources that were associated with them. One was the effort of Rockefeller Philanthropies, notably the Social Science Research Council, established in Chicago in 1923. The Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial and the Rockefeller Foundation to promote problem-oriented interdisciplinary research into the social sciences. The second was the National Research Council's effort to promote the study of racial groups and race mixture in the United States. The third was the American Council of Learned Studies Committee on Research in Native American Languages, funded mainly by an $80,000 grant from the Carnegie Corporation in 1927 to collect data on those languages which were near extinction and also tried to develop the comparative study of diversified linguistic stocks. The three initiatives concentrated on money and resources at universities that already had established graduate training programs. They sped up the process of professionalization of anthropology as an increasingly academic discipline. They also selected a small number of social scientists who would set research agendas and allocate the funds necessary to support them through conferences, grants, and fellowships. A few anthropologists, notably Edward Sappier and to a lesser extent Franz Boas, were involved with more than one of the initiatives in the 1920s and 1930s. During this period, Sappier, for example, was a member of the Social Science Research Council and the Acls Committee on Research in American Native Languages, and chaired the NRC's Division of Psychology and Anthropology. When the SSRC projects that he proposed on the study of acculturation and the relationship of the individual and culture came to fruition, the initiative of the Carnegie Rockefeller Philanthropies had the most profound effect on the development of anthropology and other social sciences, especially at the University of Chicago, which John D. Rockefeller founded in 1892. First, the Philanthropies injected more than $50 million into the advancement of social sciences in the United States during the 1920s and early 1930s. They were concerned with making the social sciences more scientific in order to promote social and economic stability, to eliminate subjective studies of social phenomena, and to develop more effective methods of social control. To achieve these goals, they supported studies concerned with curbing crime and delinquency. Second, they designated a select number of universities, Chicago, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Stanford, Berkeley, and Pennsylvania, as centers of excellence, and provided the funds and resources required to develop them as prototypical research institutions. They also funded the development of anthropology programs overseas, most notably at the London School of Economics and at the University of Sydney. First, John G. Rockefeller had financed the emergence of the University of Chicago as a major center of learning and research in the 1990s. There was a close relationship between the Rockefeller Philanthropies and the university. As a result, Chicago-based anthropologists such as Fay Cooper Cole, Melville J Herzkovitz, Ralph Linton, Robert Redfield, and Edward Sappier figured prominently in the development of the field during the late 1920s and 1930s. The interest of the Rockefeller Philanthropies in anthropology, especially in colonial policies and social management of natives, was apparent by 1926, when they invited Bronislaw Milewski and A.R. Radcliffe Brown to discuss their views with colleagues at selected universities in the United States. At the end of the summer, Radcliffe Brown sailed to Australia to assume newly created Rockefeller-funded chair in social anthropology at the University of Sydney. He saw to it that W. Lloyd Warner, who had studied anthropology with Kroeber and Lowe at the University of California, received a fellowship provided by the LSRM through the Australian National Research Council to continue his studies in Sydney. After studying an Aboriginal society in Northern Australia for 3 years, Warner accepted a position at Harvard University where he would begin to apply the ideas of Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski to the study of contemporary American society. In Cambridge, Warner met with Elton Mayo, an Australian psychiatrist who was employed by the Harvard Business School and who was a close friend of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown. Mayo had founded the Harvard's Committee on Industrial Psychology, whose research in the 1920s and 1930s was completely underwritten by the LSRM. Mayo was studying the effects of fatigue among workers at the Western Electric Hawthorne plant, where he discovered that productivity was tied in important ways to the participation of the individuals in groups, to interpersonal relations, and to cultural factors. He brought Warner into the committee in 1930 to consult on the Hawthorne project and to investigate the relationship of the industry to the community in which the workers lived. Warner turned his attention to the town of Newburyport, Massachusetts, whose largest employer was a shoe factory. With the financial support of the committee, Warner and students from the Harvard conducted a series of community studies in Newburyport from 1931 to 1936. The project came to a close in 1936 when Warner accepted a position at the University of Chicago. A study of industrial relations in a shoe factory was merely one aspect of the investigations, while much of Warner's subsequent work focused on social stratification in American society. He nevertheless remained interested in industrial relations and subsequently co-founded the University of Chicago's Interdisciplinary Committee on Industrial Relations. While the Yankee City investigations were landmark studies of an American community, they were neither the first community studies conducted by American social scientists nor the first studies of American communities. They were preceded by W.E.B. Du Bois' The Philadelphia Negro, a Social Study, Robert S. and Helen M. Lynn's Middletown, a Study of Contemporary American Culture, Robert Redfield's Tepoztlán, a Mexican Village, and Louis E. King's Study of African American Community in the Rural West Virginia between 1927 and 1931. The importance of the Yankee City studies derives partly from their thoroughness and partly from the subsequent community studies that were undertaken by participants in the project. For example, as Warner was moving to the University of Chicago in 1936, his collaborators in Newburyport, Allison Davis, Burley Gardner, and Mary Gardner, were engaged in a multi-year study of race and class relations from both sides of the color line in Mississippi. Their inquiry into race relations in the southern town followed recommendations made by both the Rockefeller Philanthropies and the National Research Council in the 1920s. In December 1920, a committee of the NRC's Division of Psychology and Anthropology, chaired by Clark Whistler, issued a confidential report recommending 6 areas for future anthropological research. The committee gave top priority to the study of racial groups in the United States. This was partly in response to the race riots in the late 1910s and the integrationist arguments of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Black nationalist arguments on Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, and the rapidly growing number of African Americans who immigrated from the South to the northern industrial cities in search of work during and after the First World War. They took the unskilled jobs that only a few years earlier had been filled by the steady stream of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, a stream that the war reduced to a mere trickle after 1914. It was the first time that African Americans had entered the industrial workforce in northern cities in significant numbers. The NRC initiative coincided in the 1920s with the gradual triumph, at least in the social sciences, of the views of Boas and others regarding race, culture, and their interconnections. In their perspective, races existed, races were variable, and races were equal. Furthermore, while there was no direct relation between race and culture, hereditary physical features, such as skin color, were socially and culturally significant in the American society because of racial discrimination and racism. Such views helped underpin the emergence of the gradual ascendancy of assimilationist perspective in the social sciences during the 1930s and 1940s. At the same time, a number of African Americans, some of whom had received advanced degrees in anthropology, used this perspective to develop an increasingly trenchant critique of American society. The NRC initiative stimulated both biological and cultural determinists. Alice Hrdlicka published a number of articles on race mixture and physical anthropology of the American Negro in his American Journal of Physical Anthropology during the 1920s. Although Ernest Houghton at Harvard was also interested in race mixture between Negroes and whites, he did not initially undertake research on this topic. He believed that it was necessary to employ black researchers in order to gain access to black communities. There are no African American students interested in physical anthropology at Harvard until Carolyn Bond Day arrived in the late 1920s. Day worked within the vindicationist perspective she had refined during her undergraduate years at Atlanta University, where W.E.B. Du Bois was a dominant intellectual force. She was also constrained by Houghton's belief. Race is a biological reality, the white race is superior, and the future of humankind depends on biology rather than cultural practices. In a study of some Negro white families in the United States, Day described similarities between black and white middle class and attributed the differences between them to racial segregation rather than biology. She also dealt with the issue of African Americans passing for white and the implications this had for racial typology. In 1923, Melville J Herzkovitz, one of Boas's students at Columbia, received a 3-year fellowship at the National Research Council to study the effect of race crossing on the American Negro. Herzkovitz, who was concerned primarily at this point in his career with the anthropometry of hybridization, taught at Howard University during this period. He was exposed to the views of black intellectuals, Alan L. Locke, the spiritual guide of the Harlem Renaissance, a biologist, Ernest E. Just, and to the results of the ongoing dialogue between intellectuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Franz Boas. Herzkovitz relied on the efforts of African American research assistants Zora Neale Hurston and Louis E. King to collect measurements of the school children and adults. He discussed the quantitative differences observed among individuals in his sample in terms of interplay biology, social and cultural factors. In his view, race was a fuzzy biological category, but an important cultural one in the country where there was growing segregation by skin color, which reinforced a certain homogeneity of beliefs in black communities. Lighter skin tones were valued more highly than darker ones. While his biological explanations were not sophisticated by today's standards, Herzkovitz in fact challenged the idea of pure races. He attempted to explain the patterns he observed in terms of political, economic, social, and cultural processes that were manifest in the preceding half-century. This is already evident in his critique of racial intelligence testing mentioned in the last chapter. Hurston and King were encouraged by Alan Locke and Ernest Just, their mentors at Howard University, to pursue their anthropological interests with Boas in Columbia. Boas sent them to Harlem to collect anthropometric measurements for Herzkovitz. At the same time, Boas and Elsie Clews Parsons were collaborating on the collection of black folklore for the American Folklore Society during the 1920s and 1930s, and the independently wealthy Parsons subsidized the work and publications of a number of Boas's students, including those of Hurston. After her work in Harlem, Hurston continued to collect black folklore and music in the Deep South. In the mid-1930s, she received the Guggenheim Fellowship to investigate folk rituals, gender roles, women's activities, and the exploitation in Haiti and Jamaica. While her books were widely acclaimed by lay audiences, they were not well received by scholars. Hurston did not complete her dissertation, and by the late 1930s, she was beginning to support herself as a dramatic coach, playwright, and part-time lecturer, and gradually lost to the profession during the 1940s. Louis E. King undertook one of the first community studies by an American anthropologist. In a rural society in West Virginia, he documented the importance of social relationships and activities that were involved in the satisfaction of basic needs. He also questioned the validity of intelligence tests, writing that emerging from the cultural background almost wholly influenced by slavery, Negro life in this area presents at this time a pattern similar to the life of the white community. The investigation reveals that there exists the development of Negro life, limited educational, economic, and social opportunities. These cultural limitations, in turn, created drastic psychological effects and inhibit the full development of the Negro's potentialities. Under these circumstances, it becomes permanent a question whether any instrument can be devised that can determine accurately the relative superiority or inferiority of intelligence, without first securing an intimate and thorough knowledge of the background of those for whom the instrument is intended to measure. When he completed his dissertation in 1932, King did not have enough money to publish the thesis and provide Columbia with 27 copies it required. As a result, he did not receive his doctorate until late 1952, after Columbia had eliminated the rule requiring that dissertations be published. King, who was unable to secure a teaching or research position during and after the Depression, worked a variety of jobs to support his family. Consequently, he too was effectively lost to and by the profession. The third initiative was the formation of the Acls Committee on Research of American Native Languages in 1927. The ground had already been prepared by the appearance of the International Journal of American Linguistics a decade earlier, in 1917, and the formation of the Linguistic Society of America in December of 1924. Boaz, Edward Sappier, and Leonard Bloomfield, who were on the editorial board of the journal, recognized that the existing professional organizations and cultural divisions within university made it difficult for individuals who conducted linguistic research to meet and discuss common problems. During the next 3 months, 264 scholars, teachers of English, German, and Romance and Slavic languages, philologists, psychologists, and anthropologists joined the new organization. The goals of the American Linguistic Society were to promote the science of linguistics, to develop its methods, and to relate the results of its inquiries to other disciplines. In 1927, Boaz, Sappier, Kroeber, and Bloomfield played instrumental roles in the creation of the Acls Committee on Research of American Native Languages. At the time, Boaz complained that there were not enough individuals with sufficient training to carry out the mandate of the committee. However, the mere existence of the committee, with its promise of funding for research, stimulated student interest in linguistics. As a result, Boaz and Sappier trained more students in linguistics, and this in turn led to the expansion of the number of linguistics programs in the country. By 1930, Columbia, Chicago, Berkeley, Pennsylvania, Washington, and Yale provided training in linguistics. Between 1927 and 1937, the committee subsidized the research of 38 scholars who collected native language texts and various kinds of information on phonology, morphology, grammar, and the vocabulary of 75 American Indian languages. Researchers supported by the committee, such as Morris Swadesh, for instance, would develop modern linguistic analysis in the United States during the 1930s and the 1940s, building on theoretical foundations established earlier by Sappier, Bloomfield, and others. The committee also provided significant levels of financial support to two Native American scholars, Ella Deloria and Yankin Dakota, anthropologist and linguist, and Jaime de Angulo, the Madoc linguist and shaman. The University of Chicago emerged as a major center of the development of American anthropology in the 1920s, partly because of the financial support provided directly and indirectly by the Rockefeller Philanthropies, and partly because of the organizational and intellectual prowess of Fay Cooper Cole and Edward Sappier. In the formative years of the university before the First World War, anthropology and sociology coexisted in the same department. While Chicago sociologists, notably Alban Small, William I. Thomas, and Robert E. Park, were prominent in their field and trained a vast majority of the sociologists with academic credentials, anthropology, led by anti-imperialist critic Frederick W. Starr, languished after the turn of the century. Fay Cooper Cole, who had arrived at the Field Museum in the late 1910s, came to the university after Starr's retirement in 1923, was largely responsible for the building of the anthropology program in the combined department and for overseeing the formation of the separate department 6 years later. One of Cole's first moves in 1925 was to hire Edward Sappier, who was widely regarded at the time as the most thought-provoking of Boas's students and whose salary was paid for 3 years by the LSRM, with the financial support of the Rockefeller Foundation from 1929 to 1934. Cole, Sapper, and Redfield, Robert Park's son-in-law, who joined the anthropology faculty in 1929, attracted graduate students who were able to fund their ethnological, archaeological, and linguistic research during the early years of the Depression. Sappier's two interrelated research interests during his years at Chicago were the psychology of culture, which soon came to be called the culture and personality of American Indian languages. The former built on the reformulation of the culture concept that occurred during the 1920s. It was fueled after 1926 by his close friendship with psychiatrist Harry Stack Sullivan, an advocate of interdisciplinary collaboration between psychologists and social scientists, and it was supported directly and indirectly by the Rockefeller Philanthropies, which promoted interdisciplinary, problem-oriented inquiries. Sappier's linguistic studies and those of his students were financed by the Acls Committee on Research in American Native Languages. Sappier had an important role of the reformulation of culture concept during the 1920s. However, he was not the only one that milieu in the number of anthropologists. Boas, Alexander Goldenweiser, Ruth Benedict, and Margaret Mead, to name only a few, perceived a close relationship between their discipline and psychology. As you will recall, English anthropologist Edward B. Taylor's definition of culture and primitive society as all of the learned behavior required by man as a member of society, including knowledge, belief, art, morals, customs, and any other capabilities and habits, implied that culture was an organic whole composed of interconnected parts. Taylor also believed that culture evolved in a linear fashion from lower to higher states and that it reached its highest level in Western Europe and the United States. Boas and his students mostly rejected the racialist implications of Taylor's evolutionary scheme and often viewed the culture of people in terms of accretions of outside elements that Robert Lowy described as a hodgepodge, that thing of shreds and patches. They began to realize the limitations of a perspective that saw culture mainly as a collection of traits brought together by chance, and to move slowly toward one that saw it in terms of shared mental patterns or collective conscience. Such a view would allow them to examine how the activities and psychic traits of people were connected and to look at the inner forces and dynamic conditions evolved and change. In a word, they were beginning to look at culture as totality whose elements were interconnected, integrated, and patterned. By the mid-1920s, Benedict, Mead, Sappier, and others were seizing upon the insights of psychoanalysts and Jesuit psychologists in order to portray the forms of integration between various behaviors in societies and the deeply held attitudes and beliefs of their members. They call these connections configurations or patterns. Benedict described cultural configurations in a path-breaking paper presented to the International Congress of Americanists in 1928. She pointed out that the Pueblo cultures of the Southwest were strikingly different from those of neighboring groups and most other Indian cultures in North America. She argued that they possessed an ethos distinguished by its sobriety, by distrust of excess, that minimizes the last possible vanishing point, any challenging or dangerous experiences. While acts of ritual or personal experience leading to the disruptive psychological states, such as frenzy and ecstasy, were absent in Pueblo cultures, they were present in a myriad of forms in other American Indian cultures. Benedict extended the idea of individual psychology types to whole cultures, and in the case of the Southwest, pointed out that the Pueblo cultures and the neighboring Pima had selected two diametrically different ways of arriving at the values of existence. While Apollonian pueblos sought to minimize disruption, their Dionysian neighbors used various disruptive means to achieve excess. She subsequently wrote that in the development of these configurations, it's no more difficult to understand than, for example, the development of an art style. In both, if we have the available material, we can see the gradual integration of elements and growing dominance of some few stylistic drives. In both, also, if we had the material, we could without doubt trace the influence of gifted individuals who have bent the culture in the direction of their own capacities. But the configuration of culture always transcends the individual elements that have gone into its making. The cultural configuration builds itself over generations, discarding, as no individual may, the traits that are uncongenial to it. It takes itself ritual and artistic and activational modes of expression that solidify its attitude and make it explicit. Many cultures have never achieved this thoroughgoing harmony. Benedict's essays focused attention on the emotional value and orientations that underpinned everyday life and showed that not all cultures were integrated in the same manner or even to the same degree. While she was aware of the issues, Benedict did not answer questions concerned with how cultural configurations develop or how they influence individual behavior, or with the effects of individual differences in behavior and beliefs in particular contexts, nor did she particularly share Sappier's emphasis on the importance of the individual. Nevertheless, her views and those of Sappier would gain adherents in the SSRC's interdisciplinary seminars on culture and personality. Thus, by late 1920s, the idea shaped by Benedict, Sappier, and others that culture was the product of both psychic and historical factors, that it was functionally integrated to some extent, that it was patterned, and that cultural configurations were historically emergent, were commonplace in the field. It is clear that ideas about language played an important role in the reconceptualization of culture that occurred in the 1920s. The new theory of culture followed a linguistic model. Both select a small number of elements out of a larger range of possibilities. Both are patterned, both change throughout time, and both are shared or participated in by the members of a community. This should not be particularly surprising, because many anthropologists from the first generation of academically certified professionals routinely carried out both ethnographic and linguistic research, and some, such as Kroeber or J. Alden Manson, did archaeology as well. As the Great Depression of 1929 wore on, fewer and fewer young men and women attended college. This slowed and almost brought to a halt the development of anthropology as an increasingly academic discipline in the 1930s. Despite of this, 149 men and 30 women obtained PhD degrees in anthropology between 1929 and 1941. More than half of them found their first jobs not in the university, but rather in the government or in one of the private or public relief agencies that were attempting to alleviate the miserable conditions being experienced by the majority of the American population in the 1930s. That social science research should be relevant and practical was a basic tenet of both Rockefeller and Carnegie philanthropies. The dire conditions of the American people also brought a number of anthropologists into contact with community-based organizations, labor unions, and leftist political parties. In the process, some of them became outspoken critics of racism and classism of the American society, while others spoke out against fascism in Germany, Italy, Spain, and the United States. Anthropology and the New Deal, 1933 to 1941. The 100 or so anthropologists hired by the government after 1933 were typically employed by a work relief agency. the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the Department of Agriculture. They were asked to apply their knowledge to problems confronting the country, unemployment, the conditions on Indian reserves, or the circumstances of small farmers. That social science knowledge should have immediate practical utility was, of course, the dominant viewpoint of the Rockefeller Philanthropies, and most of the anthropologists employed by the government had already participated in Rockefeller-funded projects. In practical terms, this meant that a significant number of them came from the University of Chicago or had participated in Warner Yankee's City project at Harvard, both of which received financial support from the Rockefeller Philanthropies. They would bring their knowledge to bear on problems facing government agencies. By the end of the decade, the term applied anthropology was commonplace, and the individuals who shared this perspective formed the Society for Applied Anthropology in 1941. However, archaeologists were the first anthropologists to benefit from the New Deal legislation. In the summer of 1933, the local Office of Federal Emergency Relief Administration in Marksville, Louisiana, requested that the Smithsonian Institution send two archaeologists, Frank M. Setzler and James A. Ford, to supervise a crew of more than 100 employed to excavate and restore prehistoric mounds in the area. In November 1933, the Civil Works Administration called on the Smithsonian Institution to provide additional archaeologists to direct field projects in states with warm winters and high unemployment. During the next 2 months, 11 projects employing 1,500 men and women were initiated in California, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and Tennessee, and another 1,000 workers were engaged in archaeological survey and excavation projects sponsored by the Tennessee Valley Authority. These pilot projects showed that large numbers of laborers, supported by federal relief funds, could be used fruitfully in excavation of large archaeological sites. As a result, archaeological research became an integral part of the programs of the Work Project Administration from 1934 to 1943. Archaeology appealed the relief agencies because it was labor-intensive and did not produce a commodity that competed with the private sector. The relief archaeology programs were actually multi-tiered bureaucracies that operated simultaneously at both federal and state levels. Congressional audits from 1938 onwards meant that the WPA and the archaeologists it employed had to develop criteria for evaluating performance. While the federal archaeologists employed by the Smithsonian or the National Park Service, and most of these working through state-level WPA office, supported standardization, archaeologists in New Mexico and Tennessee opposed uniform criteria, arguing that control of archaeological research should be vested at the level of individual states and that such efforts represented federal interference and insufficient appreciations of local circumstances. The need to organize data and establish procedures for comparing information from different sites sparked a theoretical debate over typology, classification, and the meaning of various concepts that would last more than 2 decades. The data collected by WPA archaeology programs also underwrote the first historical synthesis of Native American cultural development in the eastern United States. The sudden demand in the mid-1930s for competently trained archaeologists to supervise workers outstripped the supply and stretched the ability of the universities to produce them on short notice. At the time, only 2 universities, Chicago and Kentucky, had summer field schools that provided students with hands-on training at nearby archaeological sites. Many of the men and women employed as archaeological supervisors participated in the University of Chicago Field School, and virtually all of the men and women trained in the Americanist archaeology during the 1930s worked at one time or another on a WPA-funded project. The demand for archaeologists also led Fay Cooper Cole and others to form the Society for American Archaeology in December of 1934 in order to gain a voice in policy making and to curb the activities of looters. In 1933, John Collier was appointed Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He found himself in charge of a sprawling bureaucracy of more than 5,000 employees across the country, whose activities were organized into a series of administrative departments. His aim was to reverse the assimilationist policies of his predecessors in the office and to grant tribes a greater degree of self-reliance and to make the Bureau more responsive to the people it was supposed to serve. To accomplish this, he lobbied for the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 and employed a handful of anthropologists in varying capacities. One of his first initiatives was an experimental school in which Gladys Richard and Ruth Underhill were involved with Indian service and teaching Navajos to write the Navajo language. The success of this program led Edward Keddard to develop orthographies for other Indian languages, and Underhill and others to prepare historical ethnographies for several tribes. Anthropologists employed by the Indian Service also studied the adjustment of men and women who had graduated from the Indian boarding schools. In December of 1934, Collier outlined the provisions of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. At the annual meeting of the American Anthropological Association 8 months earlier, he had met with officers of the association and a small group of anthropologists interested in practical or applied anthropology in order to enlist their aid in his effort to revitalize Indian life. The group included Fay Cooper Cole and A.R. Radcliffe Brown from Chicago, W. Lloyd Warner from Harvard, John M. Cooper, the association secretary, and William Duncan Strong from BAE. As soon as Collier received a congressional appropriation to implement provisions of the IRA, he began to employ anthropologists sympathetic to his aims. His first hire in 1935 was H. Scudder McKeel, one of Whistler's students at Yale, whose dissertation had dealt with the psychological effects of acculturation among the Sioux. McKeel and 5 additional anthropologists hired the following year formed the Applied Anthropology Unit of the IBA. The primary task of the unit, which was located in Washington, was to provide information about the social organization of those Indian groups that had selected to adopt charters. They sent this information to lawyers in the IBA's Tribal Reorganization Division, who were charged with drafting their tribal constitutions. Various problems were sent from the inception of the unit, and tensions quickly developed between anthropologists and lawyers. For example, on one hand, anthropologist Morris Opler pointed out that tribes, such as the Creek, traditionally did not have the kind of centralized political organization called for in the IRA. On the other, agents and lawyers paid no attention to the findings and recommendations of the anthropologist. The anthropologists of the Applied Anthropology Unit increasingly found themselves in an untenable position. Their intentions were seen as suspect both by BIA officials whom they had to deal and by the Indians whom they were collecting information. Neither Collier nor the anthropologists fully appreciated the resistance to change or inertia of the BIA bureaucracy itself, which was thoroughly imbued, except possibly at the upper levels, with an assimilationist worldview that stood stark in opposition to the kind of controlled cultural diversity mandated by IRA provisions. The unit was disbanded in 1938 as a result of congressional budget cuts and the opposition within the BIA itself to the anthropologists and their activities. The anthropologists employed in the Techno Cooperation Unit, a program funded jointly by the BIA and the Soil Conservation Service of the Department of Agriculture, fared a little better. The roots of this unit dated back to 1933, when the federal government began to express concern that soil erosion resulting from overgrazing in the western part of the Navajo Reservation threatened the silt up the Hoover Dam Reservoir. Collier had appeared before the Navajo Tribal Council in 1933 to announce that the federal government had mandated $1 million for soil conservation studies and that these funds were tied to reductions in the size of their sheep and goat herds. The Navajo opposed stock reduction and soon resisted all programmings emanating from the BIA offices. In 1936, Collier employed anthropologists Burleigh Gardner and Solon T. Kimball, who were Warner's student, John Provence from Chicago, to conduct human dependency studies focusing on land use, land ownership, and population distribution in one district of the Navajo Reservation. In 1936, Kimball and Provence discovered that the basic land use units in Navajo society were small groups of matrilineally related families that came to be called outfits. They recommended that the economic and political programs among the Navajo be organized along the same lines. From Collier's perspective, this was the high point of anthropology's involvement in the BIA. Nevertheless, the advance of Kimball and Provence went unheeded by the BIA, lawyers, and government officials committed to the existing administrative structure and policies. The budget cuts of 1938 ultimately doomed the TCBIA, and at least 20 other human dependency studies were not completed after the unit was disbanded in 1939. In 1939, M.L. Wilson, Undersecretary of Agriculture, and Carl Taylor, Chief of the Bureau of Agricultural Economics, invited Conrad Arzenberg, John Provence from the BIA, and W. Lloyd Warner, Robert Redfield, and Horace Minor from the University of Chicago to meet with them to discuss how cultural anthropologists could contribute to problems of concern in the Department of Agriculture. In the wake of the meeting, the department sponsored rural life studies in 70 counties across the country. However, because of the war looming on the horizon and the consequent diversion of resources and personnel, only 6 of the rural life studies were actually completed. The most important and controversial was Walter Goldschmidt's As You Sow. Goldschmidt examined the development of agribusiness and profound shaping effects it had on class and race relations in the Central Valley of California. His study drew eerie on the corporations and politicians who saw it as a threat and established practices and relations in the region. Cultural anthropologists employed by the federal government in the 1930s had to confront 2 major problems. 1, the social organization of various American Indian tribes, and 2, the changes that were taking place or had occurred in the recent past among Native peoples as a result of assimilation and acculturation. A significant number of government anthropologists were attracted to the functionalist view of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown, both whom believed that the discipline should be scientific, practical, and responsive to the needs of colonial administration. It should also be, in their view, comparative and non-historical, a perspective that contrasted with the historical thrust of much of American anthropology at the time. Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown had already made their views known during the Rockefeller-sponsored lecture tours of the United States. The University of Chicago became the beachhead for British functionalism in the 1930s. The government anthropologists who were trained there were further exposed to the structural functionalism by Radcliffe Brown, who taught at the university from 1931 to 1937, and by W. Lloyd Warner, who moved to Chicago from Harvard in 1936. However, Radcliffe Brown and Warner were not the only functionalists at Chicago. Robert Redfield, who had joined the department in 1928, was also making use of functionalist arguments in his analyses of peasant communities in Mexico. Unlike his English colleague, Redfield did not subordinate culture to social structure. Redfield was hired as a part-time research associate by the Carnegie Institute of Washington in 1929 to direct a comparative study of Yucatan Maya communities that would complement and extend its multidisciplinary investigations centered on archaeological excavations and restoration of Chichen Itza. Redfield and his collaborators studied 4 folk or peasant communities with distinctive cultures and whose residents were isolated to varying degrees from the city of Merida. In 1934, Redfield employed Sol Tax, who studied with Linton and Radcliffe Brown, to extend the CIW's ethnological fieldwork into Guatemala, where highland communities exhibited different cultural practices from those found in Yucatan. Their publications echoed the cultural pluralism of the anti-incorporationalist indigenista movement in Mexico during the 1930s, as well as the anti-assimilationist views of John Collier in the United States. Redfield believed that the most powerful force underlying the changes taking place in the rural communities of Yucatan was that they were simultaneously less isolated and in greater contact with urban centers such as Merida. However, the changes were not occurring uniformly across the peninsula. The residents of Tulsic in Quintana Roo were quite isolated relative to other villages and barely affected by the demands of the state. They spoke Maya and followed traditional Maya lifeways. Other communities, such as Chancom or Zitas, were more influenced by the cultural practices of modern Mexican society. Some residents spoke Spanish, read newspapers, went to school, and worked for individual gain rather than for the benefit of the community as a whole. Redfield viewed cultural diversity of Yucatan in terms of folk-urban continuum, one end of which was anchored in remote tribal villages such as Tusic, other in the continuum that was firmly tied to modern urban centers such as Merida, whose cultural practices differentially influenced the residents of folk or peasant communities, some of whom who had already adopted or were in the process of adopting features of modern national culture. Thus, rural communities, such as Chancom or Zitas, with their amalgams of Spanish and Indian cultural elements, occupied points midway along the folk-urban continuum. Cities, in Redfield's view, were the source of change, and their folk communities, depending on the intensity and frequency of their contact with urban culture, differentially exhibited the disorganization, secularization, and alienation resulting from their increased communication with modern cities. The values of their residents were transformed as folk communities were increasingly enmeshed in the lifeways of the city. As a contrast, the remote, relatively self-sufficient villages of Yucatan, Tax described the municipos in highland Guatemala in terms of economics, specialization, and mutual interdependence. Each community grew a particular crop, part of which was consumed by the farmers and part of which was sold in a nearby market for cash that was used to purchase other necessities. He also distinguished Indians and Ladinos, partially in cultural terms and partially in terms of technical division of labor that existed in communities where both resided. He further noted that the Indians of some communities also worked seasonally elsewhere as wage workers, and that the members of other municipos, such as Atitlan or Chichicastenango, bought the produce of other communities in wholesale quantities to take to other markets to sell. While local cultures of Guatemala communities were relatively homogeneous and isolated, families were less integrated into them and exhibited more impersonal relations and individualistic behavior than their Yucatan counterparts. In other words, the Guatemalan communities did not fit neatly into Redfield's folk-urban continuum. The functionalist theoretical perspectives of Redfield and Tax led them to emphasize the relative cultural homogeneity of the communities, the harmony of social and interpersonal relations, and the value orientations shared by the majority of their members. stressing the functional interrelations of local cultural elements. They did not consider fully the implications of rural class structures, exploitation, or the disputes and conflicts that disrupted everyday life in these communities. Some critics, such as Oscar Lewis, would point out that these folk societies were in fact peasant villages that were never isolated from urban centers, but always existed in symbiotic and dependent relation with them. Others, notably Sidney Mintz, would show that Redfield's folk-urban continuum failed to account for the rural proletarian communities associated with the modern henequen plantations in Yucatan. Redfield's attention to process of culture change and their effects on the individuals experiencing it resonated with a wider concern of American anthropologists in the 1930s. Acculturation, or what happened when groups of individuals with different cultures came into continuous contact, resulting in changes in the original cultural patterns of one or both groups. Before the First World War, some assumed that American Indians would either assimilate or disappear, that European immigrant groups, with the passage of enough time, would disappear in the American melting pot, and that the Negro problem would somehow resolve itself. However, none of these came to pass, and many Indians, blacks, and ethnic minorities actively resisted acculturation and assimilation. As a result, in 1935, the SSRC's Committee on Personality and Culture established a subcommittee on acculturation composed of anthropologists from the greater Chicago area, Redfield, Linton, and Herzkovitz, to assess the current status of acculturation studies in the United States and to identify fruitful lines of inquiry. The committee found that while the literature dealing with acculturation was extensive, it was difficult to compare cases because the published accounts often emphasized different aspects of the process or features of larger totalities. The subcommittee felt that a series of studies prepared in accordance with a single plan or outline would be extremely useful for the testing of certain hypotheses. The subcommittee raised a series of questions for consideration. What was the nature of the contact? For instance, was it friendly between entire groups or certain kinds of individuals? 2. What circumstances surrounding the contact and subsequent acculturative processes were there? For example, inequalities between the groups, or was force involved? 3. What processes of acculturation were involved? That is, how were traits selected by the donor and recipient culture, and how were they integrated into cultural configuration of recipient groups? 4. What psychological mechanism underpinned the acceptance, rejection, and integration of the new elements? And 5. What were the results of the acculturation? In other words, were large numbers of new traits accepted? Were original traits from both cultures combined to produce a newly, smoothly functioning whole? Or was the acceptance of new traits resisted? Their recommendations, built on anthropological studies concerned with the interplay of personality and culture, with the idealist conceptions of culture that stressed the patterning of its elements and the unconscious core value orientations that shaped and brought consistency and distinctive integration of those cultural configurations. The subcommittee was particularly concerned with the psychology of acculturation, that is, with determining the covert value orientations of the recipient cultures, as well as the psychological characteristics of individuals from those cultures who might accept or reject elements from the donor culture under the particular circumstances of contact. They want to determine why some societies adopted new elements and others did not, or why some individuals in a particular society adopted foreign traits while others rejected them. A few years later, Clyde Kluckhohn would point out how important it was for administrators in the BIA to understand the covert culture, the unconscious value orientations of a society in situations where acculturation was taking place or where the adoption of new traits was being resisted. The subcommittee's emphasis on reciprocity and the shifts in value patterns that occurred during moments of acculturation deflected attention away from an important fact. Alexander Lesser, a Columbia-trained anthropologist sympathetic to the left at the time, had already described it in the following way. The problem of acculturation, when we are considering the American Indians in relation to their adjustment to a European culture, is a problem of assimilation. In acculturation, the cultural groups involved are in an essentially reciprocal relationship. Both give and take. In assimilation, the tendency is for the ruling cultural group to enforce the adoption of certain externals in terms of which is superior adjustment seems to be attained. The adopting culture is not in a position to choose. Lesser, the leftist, was clearer than his liberal colleagues on the importance of power relations during episodes of cultural change. So was Malinowski, who wrote, "The whole concept of European culture as a cornucopia from which things are freely given is misleading. It does not take a specialist in anthropology to see that European give is always highly selective. We never give any native people under our control. We shall never, for it will be sheer folly as long as we stand on the basis of our present realpolitik in the following elements of our culture. 1. The instruments of physical power, firearms, bombing planes, poison gas, and all that makes an effective defense or aggression possible. 2. We do not give out instruments of political mastery. 3. We do not share with them the substance of economic wealth and advantages. Even when under indirect economic exploitation, we allow the native a share of the profits. The full control of the economic organization remains in the hands of Western enterprise. 4. We do not admit them as equals to church, assembly, school, or drawing room. Full political, social, and even religious equality is nowhere granted." The dominant orientation of acculturation studies resonated with a third major focus of American anthropologists during the 1930s, the interpretation of culture and personality. New Haven and New York were centers for these inquiries, particularly after Sappier left Chicago in 1931 to accept a position at Yale. From 1932 to 1936, Sappier taught seminars dealing with the impact of culture on personality and the psychology of culture. However, his focus on the formative power of culture on personality was ultimately overwhelmed by the revolutionary sociology and behavioralist approaches of the social scientists in Yale's Institute of Human Relations, which was well funded by the Rockefeller Philanthropies. As a result, Sappier produced his agenda in 1935 through an interdisciplinary conference he organized in New York for the NRC's Committee on Personality in Relation to Culture. However, a year later, the NRC declined to fund further activities planned by Sappier and the committee. Following a heart attack in 1936, Sappier recuperated in New York and spent increasing amounts of time there until his death a year later. The arrival of psychoanalysts from Central Europe in the early 1930s coincided with Ruth Benedict's interest in cultural configurations manifest in her Patterns of Culture to stimulate interest of a number of New York-based anthropologists in the interplay of culture and personality in the mid-1930s. Benedict and psychoanalyst Abram Gardner taught seminars on the cultural determinist personality adaptation in the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and Columbia. These were continued after 1937 by Gardner and Ralph Linton, as Benefit dropped out of the seminar and worked with other psychoanalysts, notably Harry Stack Sullivan and Karen Horney Manson. The seminars yielded a small but influential number of publications, including Gardner's The Individual and His Society, Cora Du Bois' The People of Alor, and Linton's The cultural background of personality. The explorations of Benedict and Sappier regarding the interconnections between culture and personality development were also the medium in which Margaret Mead produced studies of cultural conditioning of the behavior of teenage girls in Samoa, the cultural processes by which children became adults in Manus, and the cultural determination of sex roles. The ongoing concern with race relations and racism discussed earlier constituted the fourth major focus of American anthropologists during the 1930s. From 1932 to 1934, Hortense Powdermaker, a former union organizer trained with Malinowski, carried out an SSRC-supported ethnographic study of race relations in Indianola, Mississippi, John Dillard's Southertown. In 1935, Allison Davis, supported by the Rockefeller funds channeled to Warner through Harvard's Committee on Industrial Psychology, worked with white colleagues, Burley and Mary Gardner, in Natchez, Mississippi, to study the linkages between social classes and racial castes from both sides of the color line. Davis and his wife, who had worked among the more affluent members of the black community, found it difficult to establish rapport with the black lower classes, so in 1935 they invited St. Clair Drake to work with members of the lower classes. During the 2 years he was in Natchez, Drake spent a part of his time organizing sharecroppers. After returning to Chicago in 1937, Drake met Horace Caton, a black sociologist and socialist. Together they would launch a theoretically sophisticated 2-year study of the black community in Chicago, financed by the WPA. Anthropologists from New York City were involved also in a series of projects, including the Carnegie Corporation's Negro in America project, which culminated with the publication of Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem in Modern Democracy. In 1937, the Carnegie Corporation appointed Myrdal, a former fellow of the Rockefeller Organization, recommended by its director, Beardsley Rummel, to carry out a study of the Negro problem. The project would cost nearly $300,000 over the next 7 years. Myrdal discussed the project with a number of African American scholars: Ralph Bunche, E. Franklin Frazier, Allen Davis, Horace Caton, St. Clair Drake, Abram Harris, Alan Locke, and W.E.B. Du Bois, among others. He also solicited criticisms and suggestions from anthropologists including Boas, Benedict, Herzkovitz, Linton, and Powdermaker. In addition, he employed Columbia-trained anthropologists Ashley Montague and Bernard J. Stern, among others, to prepare research memoranda on particular subjects. Simply put, many of the scholars that Myrdal consulted were socialist, inspired by the writings of Karl Marx. In fact, Du Bois, the Howard University Circle, Frazier, Harris, and Locke, and anthropologists at Columbia and Chicago, held more radical views than Myrdal, who was a social democrat. Many of them, including Benedict and Montague, would subsequently publish books depicting the fallacy of race and the politics of racial prejudice in the United States. Benedict and Mildred Ellis wrote a pamphlet for the National Education Association addressing the myth of the master race. And Benedict and Jean Weltfish wrote a pamphlet for the Public Affairs Committee on the Races of Mankind that was distributed to inductees of the armed services and USO centers until Southern Congressman on Military Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives denounced the pamphlet, claiming it showed all techniques of communist propaganda, and they banned it from all military installations. The rising tides of anti-Semitism and fascism in Europe increasingly became matters of concern for American anthropologists in the 1930s. Boas was already involved by spring of 1933. His were among the first books burned by the Nazis. By the fall of that year, Boas and Benedict were already engaged in discussions with colleagues about how to best attack the ideologies of fascism, racism, and anti-Semitism. Their concern was to prevent fascism from taking hold in the United States. They found allies, such as Albert Einstein, in organizations that were concerned with fascism in the Spanish Civil War. They founded organizations such as the American Committee for Democracy and the Intellectual Freedom, which was labeled a Communist Front organization by the Dice Committee in 1942. Because of their anti-fascism, the FBI kept files on the activities of both Boas and Benedict from 1936 onward. While neither Boas nor Benedict belonged to the Communist Party of the United States, several of their students did, and they were certainly sympathetic to the aims of the party. In a letter to Earl Browder, the incarcerated National Secretary of the party, Boas wrote, "A long life has taught me that the hope of the future lies in our willingness to rise above prejudices that separate man, one social group from the other. We must learn to see a common goal for humanity as a whole, a goal diversified in form, but a unit because it's based on love of mankind and loyalty to ideals, and not on loyalties to a group interests, whatever they may be. This ideal is not easily attained, for it seems to be an ancient, biological characteristic of animal life that group consciousness implies group conflict. However, the history of mankind shows that the group limits can expand so as to include millions, and the purest minds have always envisioned a group consciousness that must embrace humankind as a whole and forbid group conflict. However much I may disagree with the methods of your party and demand obedience of party members, I recognize that the final ideal of your party agrees with this lofty aim. If you set this above party disciplines and allow your party members a free set discussion of party procedure, you fulfill a useful function in society. I have met many young people who profess to be communists, and my judgment is that they are attracted to the ideals and equality of all members of mankind. Among them are the best of our youth." A number of anthropology students in the American universities during the late 1930s also belonged to various anti-fascist organizations. Several, John Murrah, Elman Service, and Clifton Amsbury among them, enlisted in the Lincoln Brigade in 1936 and saw action in the Spanish Civil War. Others, such as Stanley Diamond, were turned away by recruiters because they were too young, barely into their teens, when war broke out. Eleanor Leacock described being denied a security clearance in 1944 by the FBI because of her fascist political activities as an undergraduate at Radcliffe and Barnard. Others who belonged in the leftist and anti-fascist organizations in the late 1930s, Gene Weltfish and Morris Sweatish, to name only two, would later lose their jobs to anti-communist fever of zealots who carried out the wishes of Senator Joseph McCarthy's Senate Internal Security Committee in the early 1950s. War clouds loomed on the horizon with steadily increasing intensity from the time of Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the Nazis' rise to power in Germany in 1933. As the threat of the Second World War grew more imminent, American anthropologists continued to work for various government agencies, but their activities also began to merge steadily with new undertakings toward the end of the decade that involved mobilizing the American people for war. The war economy set in motion in the late 1930s ended the Depression and boosted the productivity of American firms beyond the levels of boom years in 1920s. By 1940, the demands of the economy and the approaching war were already affecting almost every aspect of daily life in the United States. In the process, the worldviews of anthropologists shifted almost overnight from matters of national interest to international concerns, and the focus of the profession would be changed forever. During the early 1940s, some anthropologists investigated education, personality development, and administration on Indian reservations, while others examined food habits or conducted studies of national morale. Others organized the development of foreign area and language studies. When war was finally declared, many went to work in diverse capacities for the government, such as data analysts, researchers for the War Relocation Authority, advisors to aircraft manufacturers who designed seats for the Army Air Force that reduced fatigue and discomfort, or forensic specialists who identified individuals from their remains after the war. A number served with the Office of Strategic Services in Europe and Africa, while others were employed by the FBI or military intelligence in Latin America. Many more, however, served in the military as average citizens who either enlisted or were drafted. Anthropology and the War Years, 1941 to 1945. Let us review some of the institutional settings in which anthropologists were employed during the war years. What made anthropologists particularly attractive to various federal agencies was their holistic, cross-cultural perspective, and the anthropologists made use of the opportunities that were created by the war. The second phase of the BIA's involvement of anthropology began in the fall of 1941. John Collier contracted with W. Lloyd Warner of the University of Chicago's Committee on Human Development to study education, personality development, and administration on 6 Indian reserves. Laura Thompson, who had studied with Kroeber and Lowy at Berkeley before working in the Pacific during the 1930s, coordinated the project, while Warner directed and supervised the research. In 1944, supervision of the project shifted to the officers of the Society for Applied Anthropology. Building on culture and personality studies of Sappier and others in the 1930s, the 6 projects involved cooperative investigations by anthropologists, psychiatrists, and physicians that focused on child rearing, education, and the growth of interpersonal relations. Their studies of the Hopi, Sioux, Navajo, Zuni, and Papago were completed and published in the mid-1940s. Thompson then reviewed the effectiveness of various Indian service policies and programs and made a number of recommendations that were designed to improve the welfare of the communities, integrate the services at the community level, recognizing that there were differences between tribes and what might be ideal on one reservation might be disastrous on another. Integrate tribal members, especially on traditional health practitioners, into the Indian service, pay attention to existing child-rearing practices, develop resources on the reservations, and decentralize the BIA. At the time, her recommendations went largely unheeded. Concern over the welfare of poor rural populations led to the second area of employment. In late 1940, Vice President Henry Wallace and M.L. Wilson of the USDA expressed concern over the well-being of rural populations in the country. With SSRC funding, a pilot study was designed and directed by Wilson, W. Lloyd Warner, Margaret Mead, and others. John Bennett, who studied food habits of rural peoples in southern Illinois, emphasized the determinant roles played by social and economic factors. After war was declared on December 7th of 1941, attention shifted from welfare of rural populations to that of the American population as a whole, and control over research on nutrition was taken over by the NRC's Committee of Food Habits, which Margaret Mead was executive secretary, and John Cooper, Ruth Benedict, and Warner were members. Investigators shifted their attention to low-income groups in the eastern industrial states, low-income rural and black communities in the southeast, and various racial, national, and cultural groups in isolated areas. Fred Egan of the University of Chicago, for example, investigated the food habits of Indians and Hispanics in the Southwest. Given the wartime food shortages, the NRC's committee was concerned with assessing dietary changes, the resistance or readiness of American population to adopt new consumption patterns and attitudes towards food relief. The committee focused its advertising on housewives. While few of any changes resulted from food habits research conducted during the war, studies did have an effect on the federal government's nutrition and food policies. A number of wartime agencies, established by executive orders during the winter and spring months of 1942, employed the services of anthropologists. These agencies were major sources of employment during the war. About 20 anthropologists were employed by the most infamous of new agencies, the War Relocation Authority, which was established in March to administer the 10 concentration camps where about 140,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast who had been dispossessed of their property and deprived of their civil rights were interned during the early years of war. 9 camps were under the authority of the WRA from its inception, since the 10th at Poston, Arizona, was located on Papago Indian Reservation. It was under the jurisdiction of John Collier, the Commission of Indian Affairs, until 1943, when management passed it to the WRA. Anthropologists were involved from the inception of the camps in 3 separate research projects that would provide administrators with information they needed to run the camps efficiently. In March 1942, John Provence of the Bureau of Agricultural Economics was named Chief of the Community Management Division, and John F. Embry, a Chicago-trained anthropologist with research experience in Japan, headed the documentation section. Believing in the necessity for social science research on the relocation camps, they lobbied for the creation of the Community Analysis Section, which was established in February 1943. Social unrest at the camps underscored the need for social analysts at centers. The CAS employed 20 anthropologists to investigate and analyze the causes of social unrest. In 1942, 6 months after assuming control of the center of Patterson, Collier named psychiatrist anthropologist Alexander Layton, already a consultant on the Indian Personality Education Project, to investigate everyday life in the camp. Layton employed 2 anthropologists and 15 Japanese Americans to carry out the research. The third, the Japanese American Evacuation Resettlement Study, was independent from the other 2. It was directed by sociologist Dorothy Swain Thomas, who had earlier worked on Mydrill's Carnegie-funded study of the Negro problem in America. With the support of Milton Eisenhower, who was the director of the WRA and the University of California, Thomas received about $90,000 from various foundations to study the effect that enforced mass migration of Japanese Americans in California might have in post-war years. She was particularly concerned with cultural conflict, assimilation, how the Japanese communities adjusted to their incarceration, and the impact that these might have on California agriculture. Robert Lowy and other UC faculty members served initially as consultants, and 5 graduate students, including 2 anthropologists, were employed to collect information, some as participant observers in the camps. Thomas required that the analysts refrain from publishing any data they collected until after the war. At the time, she refused to recommend the publication of Morton Grosden's doctoral dissertation in political science, Political Aspects of the Japanese Evacuation, because he argued that in California, state and local politicians and economic interest groups had applied pressure on the military to remove all Japanese from the state. Grosden's work was ultimately published by the University of Chicago Press in 1949 as American Betrayed: Politics and Japanese Evacuation. The other 2 government agencies that employed a significant number of anthropologists were the Office of War Information and the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor of the Central Intelligence Agency, both of which were established in the early months of 1942. Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Alexander Layton, Gregory Bateson, and Clyde Cluckhone were prominent analysis for the Foreign Morale Analysis Division of the OWI. They produced a series of national character studies that attempted to predict behavior of the citizens of nation-states: Thailand, Burma, Japan, Germany, and Romania. The impetus for the national character studies came from earlier investigations of linkages between culture and personality development. They had a number of distinctive features. In Mead's words, they covered those aspects of personality that could be referred to national institutions that transcended the regional, class, or ethnic subdivisions within a nation-state. The analysis frequently had no first-hand knowledge of the citizens of those countries. They relied instead on information that could be gleaned from published accounts, diaries, movies, and interviews with individuals residing in the United States. They focused on the aspects of the cultures that were relevant to the war, such as the attitudes of their citizens regarding victory or defeat, or in the case of Japan, the importance of the emperor as a universally respected symbol that had to be retained both as a rallying point for surrender and a vehicle for post-war change. The most enduring of the OWI's national character studies was probably Benedict's The Chrysanthemum and Sword, the Patterns of Japanese Culture. While she appreciated the significance of cultural differences by the subtle dynamics of change, Benedict was also aware of the difficulties of applying psychiatric analysis of an individual to an entire undifferentiated citizenry of a nation-state. The same cannot be said for Jeffrey Gore's analysis of the Japanese, which received more publicity at the time. Gore depicted the Japanese as primitive, infantile, abnormal, and tormented by an inferiority complex. He was convinced that their values and patterns of behavior were shaped by child-rearing and early childhood experiences. In an internal OWI memo, Clacone expressed his disapproval, referring to this approach as the Scott tissue interpretation of history. Earlier, by the 1930s, the SSRC and Acls were already acutely aware that the United States was ill-prepared to wage war on a global basis. Its citizens knew woefully little about the cultures and languages of peoples living outside the United States and Europe. Throughout the 1930s, two foundations advocated the need to develop interdisciplinary studies in American universities. Earlier in the decade, they had created a series of committees to coordinate research and resources on China, Japan, the Pacific, and Latin America. The activities of these committees expanded as the threat of war grew. For example, in 1935, the Acls established its Committee on Latin America Studies with 29 members, 7 of whom are anthropologists: Robert Redfield, A.V. Kidder, A.L. Kroeber, Clark Whistler, Alfred M. Tozer, Carl Guth, and John M. Cooper. At the same time, the Advisory Committee for the Handbook of Latin American Studies was established by the Acls, SSRC, American Geographical Society, and the Universities of Chicago and Michigan. The handbook was a periodic survey of knowledge in all fields in a major world area. By the end of the 1930s, the Rockefeller Association and other philanthropies increased their support for work on Latin America. In 1940, the Acls SSRC Joint Committee on Latin American Studies was established as the NRC's more specialized Committee on Latin American Anthropology, whose charge was to coordinate research and resources with government needs. Projects such as these articulated with those of government agencies such as the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, which was established by the federal government in 1940 to promote its good neighbor policies with Latin American countries. Nelson Rockefeller, who had gained an extensive knowledge of Latin America and its people during the 1930s, was named head of the OCIA. He implemented a series of policies that involved anthropologists. He provided $114,000 federal funding for 10 archaeological projects in Latin America in 1940. In 1941, which were coordinated by Wendell Bennett and George Villant of the American Museum of Natural History. He lobbied Congress for funds to publish the Handbook of South American Indians as a symbol of hemispheric unity during the war. Julian Stewart edited the handbook for BAE and the Smithsonian Institution. Rockefeller and John Collier supported the formation of the Inter-American Indian Institute in 1941 to carry out research on Indian problems of countries in the Western Hemisphere. In 1943, Stewart established and directed the Smithsonian Institute of Social Anthropology to carry out research on the Indian question in countries south of the Rio Grande. At the same time, Stewart helped Ralph Beals organize the Inter-American Society of Anthropology and History and its journal, Acta Americana. During this period, Stewart also maintained close ties with the Institute of Andean Research Investigations and with William D. Strong's Ethnographic Board, which was established by the NRC, ACLS, SSRC, and Smithsonian Institution in 1942. To make readily accessible to military and war agencies such specific regional information and evaluated personnel data as it may be available to the sponsoring institutions and the numerous other governmental outside scientific organizations with which they were affiliated on contact. Before the war, the ACLS received $100,000 from the Rockefeller Foundation to study Chinese, Japanese, Russian, and other languages, such as Thai, that were not taught in American universities. In 1942, the ACLS established its intensive language program to apply linguistics techniques developed by Bloomfield, Sappier, and others to the problems of language learning and teaching. A year later, the Army incorporated the procedures and training manuals developed by the ACLS linguistics as well as the linguistics themselves into its specialized language training program. In the next year, they trained nearly 15,000 enlisted personnel in foreign area and language studies at 55 universities across the country. In 1944, roughly 80 of the 96 linguistics attending the annual meeting of the Linguistic Society of America were being paid by the government or by the ACLS for militarily crucial work. In addition, anthropologists George P. Murdoch and John M. Whiting of Yale's Institute of Human Relations taught in Army or Navy programs established at a dozen universities to train administrative officers for occupied territories after the war. At the 14th annual meeting of the American Anthropological Association, held 3 weeks after the declaration of war, the association resolved to place itself and its resources and the specialized skills and knowledge of its members at the disposal of the country for the successful prosecution of the war. Indeed, for the next 4 years, the federal government made extensive use of anthropologists and their specialized knowledge. By the end of the war, many social scientists apparently felt the same way about their experience of the administrators of government agencies as Alexander Layton did. One of Layton's colleagues remarked that you always get one of two requests: to show that some policy the executive has already decided on is badly needed, or to show that some policy that the executive is already employing is working well. Another suggested that the administrator uses social sciences in a way that a drunk uses a lamppost, for support rather than illumination.